welcome to Surviving and Culturally Thriving, Cambridge's Independent Bookstores. So this program will feature our own Charles Sullivan, Executive Director of the Cambridge Historical Commission, and three owners or booksellers at three of our independent bookstores, Jeff Meyerson of the Harvard Bookstore, David Sandberg of Porter Square Books, and Didi Menkiti and James Fraser of the Grolier Poetry Bookshop. Now, we are well aware that there are more than 3 independent bookstores in Cambridge. And if you Google independent bookstores in Cambridge, you come up with about 10 of them. But since we only had an hour, a little bit over an hour tonight, we wanted to sort of limit it to featuring 3 presenters. So our format will be, Charlie will first present, give us a very short history, but a rich, informed history. And then each of the bookstore owners will have 10 minutes to present sort of the story of their bookstore. And then we will have Q&A. So please hold off on questions until the end of the program. Okay, let's launch into our program. Take it away, Charlie.
Okay, I'm Charlie Sullivan. I'm a member. I haven't been present much for a long time, but it's great to see so many familiar faces. Kathy asked me to speak about the history of bookselling in Cambridge from the year 1 to the present. She offered me 2 minutes to speak. I bargained her up to 5 minutes and 30 seconds. So this is going to be a race through the 20th century. I'll forget about the 19th century, except to say that Cambridge was famous as the site of the University Bookstore, and which was a progenitor of Houghton Mifflin, a university press, Harvard's own university press, and innumerable booksellers. They provided Thomas Jefferson with the library for the University of Virginia. So there's a distinguished history in Cambridge of bookselling. But in the 20th century, Cambridge or Harvard was becoming an even more prominent national university. People were coming from around the country to study at Harvard and literature and the liberal arts. And one bookseller in particular, I'll just show a few slides of the Phillips bookstore. And I guarantee that, I almost guarantee that no one remembers this site. John Phillips was a Nebraska native who studied literature at the University of Nebraska, came to Harvard in 1913, supported himself while he studied for an advanced degree by selling used textbooks, began to operate a bookstore. He was in, well, a number of different spaces, and in 1949, he moved into 1354 Massachusetts Avenue, which had the unfortunate location of being the present site of the approximately the chess tables in front of Holyoke Center, or the Smith Campus Center. It's a building that was taken down in 1964. So Phillips Books went from used books to being a general bookstore in 1949. They moved into this wonderful site at Christmas time. They had what was considered to be a state-of-the-art selling arrangement of general books, from children's books through textbooks to books of all descriptions. This was when the Coop was selling mostly textbooks, and there were not a lot of general bookstores in Harvard Square. But Phillips was successful. John Phillips died in the 1950s. He had retired by then. When Holyoke Center replaced the store, the Harvard moved them around the corner onto Holyoke Street, which was the death knell, I think. And then in 1967, they were sold out. They sold out to Brentano's and closed, as I recall, about 3 years later. That's just one aspect of what bookselling used to be like. It was focused on individuals. Frank Kramer can tell about his family's involvement, a similar involvement, probably has a similar history. But by 1990, I mean, there weren't just 6 bookstores in Harvard Square. There were more than 25 bookstores in Harvard Square, 25 general and new and used bookstores. Six of those were, six of those were general bookstores where you could get a full range of literature in all categories, like the Coop, the Harvard Bookstore, the Cambridge Booksmith, Reading International, Wordsworth, Barillary Books. These were stores that sold everything in the book trade. It was a difficult time because rents were rising. Harvard Square was getting a checkered reputation for crime and unrest in that period in the 1970s and 80s. And the internet was far in the distance, but the real threat at that time was discounting. Wordsworth was famous for introducing discounted books in Harvard Square. They were a full range bookseller, became extremely popular when Cambridge Booksmith went out. They blamed the trend to discounting. And they were followed very quickly by the other bookstores that I mentioned. Cambridge Booksmith, I'm sure some of you might remember, used to be open 24 hours a day in the mid 1960s. That was a fabulous experience when we were young, to go to Harvard Square at 2 a.m. and browse a copy of Dostoevsky or whatever your proclivities were. It didn't last very long. It didn't pay, but there's still a Booksmith in Brookline, of course. So these stores fell one by one. Booksmith closed in 1992, Reading International in 93, Barillary in 1994. And in Wordsworth Books, the discounter that drove many of these others out of business, closed in 2004. So that left only a handful of stores, the Coop and the Harvard Bookstore as the general bookstores, and then a handful of specialized bookstores. And since we did that count a few years ago, there's a used bookstore on Church Street, which wasn't present at the low point. So the scene is a little bit happier, but the corporatization, I think, of bookselling was really the death knell and the discounting was the death knell of all of those 20 plus, 25 plus bookstores that were here in probably the golden age of Cambridge bookselling. But, we think of ourselves as a very literate community that's committed to books, to actual books, to buying books. But in 2011, Amazon announced that Cambridge was the first among the nation's large cities for per capita sales of books online. Oops. I'm sorry, did you get that, or did you cut me off? Cambridge was first among large cities in per capita sales of online books. And that's the huge challenge that every bookstore sellers faces today. Thank you very much. You're muted, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Charlie. That was a fantastic 5.5-minute summary. Our next presenter is Jeff Meyerson of the Harvard Bookstore. He will have 10 minutes to share his story and talk about innovations at Harvard Bookstore. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. First, I've got to share my screen here. And now go to slideshow. Yes, I'm Jeff Meyerson, and I apologize in advance. I tried to talk about everything I know about bookselling in 10 minutes, so I'm going to talk very fast. So our store was founded in 1932 by Mark Kramer. My wife and I bought it in 2008 from Mark's son, Frank, who many of you may know. And as I guess many of you know, John Henry became my co-owner in 2021. I'll talk a little bit about that later. We occupy 5,500 square feet of retail space on Mass Ave, right across from Widener Library. And we sell new, used, and remainders, which are new books at bargain prices, and then non-book items like sweatshirts and t-shirts and reading paraphernalia. As you will know, we don't sell course books. That's the job of the Harvard Coop. We also have a warehouse in Somerville, and our staff has been unionized now for, I think, about 4 decades. They're organized by the UAW. So here's a picture from across Mass Ave of the main entrance to the store. Our store exists in 3 storefronts to the left, and then we have a basement where we sell the used and bargain books. This is a somewhat dated photograph, but it tells something about the way we think about our store. So you noticed in the left-hand aisle, we have academic new arrivals. In the right-hand, we have cultural and critical theory, women's, queer, and gender studies, Western philosophy. So we consider ourselves to be a general purpose bookstore, but at the same time, we also consider ourselves to be an academic bookstore. And what that means is while we carry the books that other bookstores typically carry across the country, but we have an unusual commitment to academic titles and books from academic presses like MIT Press. My own background, I started off life as a particle physicist. Well, after I grew up a little bit. I spent 20 years at Cambridge's own internet pioneer, Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. I was senior vice president for engineering there. And then I did an internet startup, Sonus Networks. My wife studied mathematics and computer science, and we met at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. And then she went off to Cambridge's Thinking Machines, where she built supercomputers. So what are the challenges of bookselling even prior to the pandemic? Well, books have relatively thin margins. And because the prices are printed on the books, we have very little pricing flexibility. In the last few years, labor costs have gone up significantly. As you know, Massachusetts now is a $15 minimum wage law, and occupancy costs have really gone up. For our main store, Harvard is our landlord, and they have been very supportive. And so we have a lease going till 2033 with them. But for example, our warehouse landlord just came to us and said they wanted to triple the rent and would only commit to 3 years occupancy. And so we have since, in the last few weeks, we've found an alternative to our Somerville warehouse. But that's a statement of what's happening in the real estate market in Greater Boston. And I won't say their name, but a big challenge, as was mentioned before, is the A word. So our fundamental strategy has been to emphasize where we're unique, where we can do things that the cloud-based booksellers can't. An important part of that is local involvement. We have a wonderful relationship with the Hoffman Breast Center at Mount Auburn Hospital. And I also, as an example, I serve on the boards of a number of primarily local literary themed organizations. So the Boston Book Festival, 826 Boston, which runs writing programs for K through 12, Boston Review, a great local intellectual journal, Brandeis University Press. And I recently was invited on the board of the Authors Guild, which is a nationwide organization which serves the interests of authors throughout the country. One of the things we're most known for, and has been a big growth area for us in revenue, is events. We do a lot of small events with first-time writers, less well-known writers, and we also do blockbuster events, which may be the thing we're best known for. So for example, when Jim Comey had his book, we did an event for him, had about 1,200 people there, Pete Souza, Obama's photographer, Madeleine Albright, et cetera. One of the things which has really grown in recent years is we decided to open up our warehouse where we process our remainders, the bargain books. We opened it up twice a year in December and June, and it got to the point where thousands of people were coming over two weekends in June or 2 weekends in December. And you can get a sense of what the crowd is like at the warehouse sale from this photo. We also, because a lot of authors come to our store, we offer subscription services for signed books, both for established writers, our Signed First Edition Club, and also for new writers, our New Voices in Fiction Club. Excuse me. We have a tremendous commitment to social media. We send out our weekly newsletter several times a week. And we have close to 75,000 followers on Twitter at this point, and we use all the platforms extensively. Another thing we're well known for is our espresso book machine. The machine prints paperback book in less than 5 minutes. It looks like a Rube Goldberg contraption, and it is. A lot of the books that are printed are public domain books, very old books that are of interest to scholars. But the biggest part of the customers of the book machine are local writers self-publishing their books. So with the Hoffman Breast Center, we did there was a cookbook done by them, inspired by Julia Child, called In the Kitchen. It was used as a fundraiser. Cambridge's own Missy Carter did an inspirational book called Living Lines. And one of our bestsellers was written by a teenage girl, high school student named Grace Kuhn. The book is a mystery set on the Mayflower. It's called Knox Hollow. So what are the challenges of bookselling in a pandemic? Well, our first priority was to keep everyone employed. So even when we were shut down, we didn't lay off a single staff member. But because we were shut down or had limited capacity or limited hours, it was important for us to find new revenue sources. It was very hard. It has been very hard to keep the store open and staff, in Omicron in particular, where even though we had very few infections, people live with roommates, the roommates have partners, the partners test positive, and then the staff has to isolate. Another priority is keeping the staff and customers safe, maintaining social distancing. We had to eliminate our in-person event series and also our warehouse sale, and those were big revenue drivers for us. So what do? Well, we've gone to variable hours. We reduced hours during the Omicron peak, but now we're moving towards normal hours. We went to third-party revenue sources when the store was closed. Bookshop.org is a bookselling site that shares its revenue with independent bookstores. Bonfire.org allowed us to create custom swag. We have a strict mask policy. We installed a new HVAC, put air filters with the best air filters, put air purifiers in every room, put up plastic shields, went to curbside pickup. An important change in the business was we went more extensively to the web. In fact, we created a special web team to deal with a highly increased volume of web sales. We went to virtual events. Maybe we're not doing 450 a year, but we're doing at least one every day. We created a special website for our warehouse sale, and we've gotten thousands of orders every time we hold one of these. And then, of course, we made extensive use of the government money, which was a lifesaver, really. In order to do social distancing, we had to take a lot of our bulk shipments off-site. So this is what my dining room now looks like. Here are 1,000 books by Mona Awad, her new novel, being prepared to be shipped out to, in this case, to Tennessee. Just want to mention a few things about the John Henry investment, because I've gotten a lot of questions about that. When John reached out to me, the original concern was the survival of the store. As it became clear that we were going to make it with the government grants and all of that, we began to talk about a joint vision for the future. So our first priorities is to invest in our booksellers. With John's investment, we can afford to pay them more than we could prior to that. We're going to do a major renovation of our Cambridge store to make it a better place to work and shop, but it will look the same. I get a lot of concern from customers on that issue. We're going to be overhauling our website, and we're currently doing planning on a very exciting major literary themed endeavor in Greater Boston. And I look forward at some point to talking with you about that more. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much. And you kept it at under 10 minutes. Thank you so much. Again, we'll be taking questions for all panelists after everyone has had a chance to speak. David Sandberg of Porter Square Books, would you please share your personal story and share what's going on at Porter Square Books with us?
Sure. I will. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the bookstore and my wife's and my history specifically in the bookstore. Jeff really did a wonderful job of covering a lot of the aspects of the bookselling business that I won't repeat. I'll maybe talk a little bit more about focusing really on the last 2 years and what that's done to the business I think, to Porter Square and probably in many cases to bookstores in general. So Porter Square Books does not have nearly as long a history as the Harvard Bookstore. It was started in 2004 by a group of booksellers who left the Concord Bookstore to come to Cambridge and open a bookstore in what at the time I think everyone thought was a pretty unlikely site for a bookstore, which was in Porter Square, in the space that was, for those of you who have been in Cambridge for a while, which is most of you, used to be the dress barn in between Cambridge Naturals and the hardware store. It is a general bookstore. Unlike Harvard, we don't sell used books, we sell new books only, but we sell books generally. The store started off without having a cafe, but then opened a cafe shortly afterwards. And so for the last almost all but 1 year of the store's history, we've had Zing Cafe as part of the bookstore. And I think you've probably seen over time that there's been a real trend in bookstores, whereas probably 25 years ago, you would have said it's a bad idea to put a cafe in a bookstore because they'll get coffee on the books. It's become more and more common to have various aspects of food and drink together with the bookstore, and we're no exception to that. In 2000, at the end of 2021, about 3 or 4 months ago, we opened a second bookstore, Porter Square Books Boston Edition, downtown at the Seaport, in the space, in the first floor of the space where Grub Street, the Boston Area Writers Organization, moved its headquarters. And so since October, we've been operating 2 stores. Personally, I, like Jeff, came from technology. I'm a lawyer by training. I spent many years first in private practice, in solo practice here in Cambridge, and then the last 15 years of my career, I worked for a Cambridge software company called ITA in Kendall Square. We then sold that company to Google, and I worked for Google for a couple of years. And then when I was in my mid-50s and the last kid was about to go off to college, and I was thinking about what to do next, and my wife, who had been a teacher first in elementary school and then later in preschool, was also thinking about what to do next. We read in the paper that the owners and founders of Porter Square Books were going to retire. And so we thought, well, this might be a fun thing to do next. And indeed, it has been an absolutely incredible thing. It's been going on 9 years for us now. We didn't come into the store with any great notions of changing this or changing that, because we were the ones who didn't know what we were doing. We were relying on the fact that the entire staff was staying, and even the founders from whom we were buying the store were staggering their departures, so we'd have the benefit of their expertise as well. And so we came into it, and now it's been, like I say, almost 9 years. A huge change for us came in 2018 when we saw that neither one of our children was going to want to own a bookstore when we decided to retire. And we looked around and we saw who generally owned bookstores, who bought bookstores, and seeing how our employees were not just the heart of the business, but the heart of its success, we made the decision to sell half the bookstore to a group of our employees, our senior management employees. We structured it in such a way that they could buy into the store without having to come up with money, since anyone who works in a bookstore could tell you that you generally don't make enough money working at a bookstore to buy one. And it was an exciting move, not just for the 10 people that became our co-owners, but for our other staff, for our customers, for the larger author community. And it even started a conversation nationally. Since then, I've had many conversations, and a few bookstores, in some cases with my help, have implemented a similar plan to what we did in Porter Square. I want to talk a little bit about COVID, because for the last 2 years in any kind of retail, including bookselling, that's really been what all we've been obsessed with. I think the financial threat was, in some cases, in some ways, a superficial one, not superficial in that it wasn't important, but it was on the surface. I mean, we were pretty sure that we were going to survive. Like Jeff and like almost every other bookstore, we were helped greatly by the government with PPP loans. We also were lucky enough to have a landlord who was very understanding and generous, Gravistar. I'll give a shout out to them. And they helped us. So pretty early on, it was clear that it wasn't going to be about the survival of the store, but that things were going to change dramatically in terms of how we did our business. Early on in the pandemic, as you know, and just like Jeff's store, just like every store, we had to close completely. Our business went to 100% online. In our case, we had a couple of things that made us better prepared for that. One was that we had a very strong online presence even before COVID. So even though people weren't used to necessarily buying from us so much online, they were very used to dealing with us online. So it was a little bit easier to make a transition to 100% online business. The second thing that put us in a better position was the fact that we had 2 years earlier sold the store, or half of it, to this group of employees. I can't begin to overstate what a difference that made. Had it had been Dina and me when the store closed in March of 2020, I'm not sure how we would have gotten through it. But instead, we had 12 people who were invested in the business, who were owners of the business, who cared and were affected deeply by the store's well-being and success, and who felt a heightened responsibility. And so that meant that there were all those people to step up and do whatever had to be done, and they very much did. If you look at the effects of COVID on our store, and again, I dare say in many ways, I'm talking for the bookstore industry generally, the most profound one was that it completely changed our business model. We became an online retailer. In the beginning, we were exclusively online, but even after that, online selling became a much, much bigger part of our business than it had ever been before. Just to put numbers on it, in 2019, the last full year before the pandemic, online sales accounted for less than 5% of our total sales. In 2021, it was 25%. And that change drove tremendous shifts in our processes, how we train our employees, how they spend their time, how we invest in hardware and software, how we market, how we deal with our customers, what hours we're open, the way we order books, basically everything about our business. And it is likely that most of those changes are going to persist. The second big change is how we operate as a team. Because we had to make major decisions on an almost weekly basis because the world changed every week, we instituted regular meetings, weekly meetings of our entire 12-person management team. And what survived since then is spreading of decision-making across that larger group. Zoom is a horrible tool for 12 people to have a meaningful and careful discussion, but the whole idea of working as an entire team to run much more of the business was very fruitful. The last thing I'll talk about, what not to end on too pessimistic a note, is I would say there was a real silver lining to COVID for us, and I think for most other booksellers and for the industry as a whole. It's two things, and they both have to do with the A company, whole Amazon. The first is online. As I said, in terms of what happened to our online business, until early 2020, most people assumed that Amazon was how you bought books online. People would literally say, of course, Porter Square is my local bookstore, but when I buy online, I have to buy from Amazon. I think the pandemic changed that. It made them realize that local independent bookstores can actually sell online. And Amazon and Barnes & Noble aren't the only book retailers online. The second is localism. Now, there are plenty of reasons to shop locally, which I could go into, but I think the real value of local business to community became clear to people during the pandemic. We all used to say that if you don't support your local businesses, they might not be there. Well, in the pandemic, people saw that happen in real time. So instead of giving lip service to localism, they started practicing it for real. The fact that Amazon did a lot of stupid things and offensive things didn't hurt, but the lasting change to my mind is the appreciation of local business at a level that didn't exist before. And I think that's 10 minutes, so I will stop there.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. I know I have a lot more questions relating to your program, but let us move on to our next speaker, who is Ndidi Menkidi, who with James Frazier will present Grolier Poetry Bookshop. Ndidi.
Hi, I'm just going to figure out how to share my screen. Can you all see this?
Not yet.
Yeah, okay.
And Dee Dee is presenting from Brooklyn. She's an attorney, and she is the daughter of Afiani Menkiti, a poet and professor, a philosopher, professor of philosophy at Wellesley.
All right. Hopefully you can see it now.
Yes.
Okay, great. So those two are hard acts to follow. We weren't supposed to go last, but they've done a great job in sort of laying out some of the book selling business, which they know a lot more about than me. But I will tell you about our little bookstore on Plimpton Street. We are a 404 square foot, one room, tiny bookshop on 6 Plimpton Street. And we've been around for almost 100 years. We were founded in 1927 by Gordon Carney and Adrian Gambit. At some point, Carney bought out Gambit and owned and operated the store until 1973 when he died. Luisa Solano was the next owner. She bought the store in 1974. And she expanded the store's international offerings and held a lot of readings and sort of operated it as a self-sustaining one-person business. She owned and worked in it full time. In 2006, Luisa had health issues and ran into financial hard times and was going to close the store. And that's when my father, Ifeanyi Menkiti, he decided to buy it. He had been visiting the store since the 60s and 70s when he was getting his PhD in philosophy from Harvard, and he had become friends with Luisa and many of the other prominent poets that frequent our store. And he had come to really appreciate the iconic cultural place that the store played in Cambridge life, and he did not want to see that die. He was still working as a full-time professor and investing in real estate and had 4 kids, so had no intention of running the bookstore full-time, but he just knew that this sort of cultural landmark could not die. So he purchased it, and we've had a few managers over the years. And he and my mother oversaw it. So my father would host most of the readings and host discussions after the readings. And if you haven't been yet, I suggest you visit one of our readings in person, because it's a very unique experience in this tiny space to have people, crowded in listening to poetry, and you can hear the creaks in the floor, and you have all the pictures of the prominent poets that have visited the store over the decades. And you can just listen to the poetry, and it's kind of a magical experience. So my father would host the discussions afterward. My mom would sort of be the host and bring refreshments, but they didn't work there full time. Some of the initiatives during their tenure were my dad sort of recognizing the brand and recognition and respect that the Greuler name had garnered, not just locally, but really around the world. I mean, you'll talk to people that will come in from Zimbabwe and they're like, I've heard of the Greuler. How did you hear of the Greuler? But recognizing that, he started the Greuler Poetry Press imprint, and he's published several titles by newer and prominent poets on that, with that imprint. And hopefully we'll do more with that in the future. He also continued administering an award for a couple of years, Discovery Award, where he'd collect submissions, and then he published like a Emerging Poets full-length volume. That, as you can imagine, is very labor intensive, so we haven't managed to keep up with that. But another thing, both he and my mother were lifetime educators, so they started an internship program yearly we host interns from Bennington College in Vermont. They come and intern with us for a month or two. And that's been really wonderful. They learn about the literary history in Cambridge and kind of shadow whoever's managing the store at the time. My father also, as you can imagine, bookstores are not exactly a lucrative business, but a niche poetry, 404 square foot bookstores, especially not lucrative. So the Grolier has operated at a loss for most of its history, except maybe under Louisa. And my father, pretty much supported it through most of his tenure, and it was becoming sort of a lot. So he formed the Grolier Foundation as kind of a co-entity so that people who wanted and people who love the Grolier could donate, make tax-free donations. And so we sort of have two entities. We have the LLC and the foundation. Along with the foundation, they started running cultural events sort of off-site, like they did a multimedia musical collaboration at the Oberon. They hosted things at the Sheraton. They hosted things in Martha's Vineyard. They hosted a 90th anniversary. Sorry, I'm not keeping up with my slides. They hosted a 90th anniversary street festival where they shut down Plimpton Street and poets and musicians came and performed on a little stage. I played my cello in the store. It was a nice sort of community event. During their tenure, there was a documentary made by a local documentary film student about the Groliers called The Last Sacred Place of Poetry. Learn more about the store, you can watch that. It does a lot of interviews with my mom and dad and other local poets who have been friends of the Grolier. Let's see. I'm going to kick it over to James, who is our current manager. James has worked with us since 2018, but recently took over managing things in last summer. During the pandemic, since the readings were such a core part of who we are, it was difficult because we're as much sort of a cultural landmark and community hub as we are a retail establishment. And so the readings are really the heart of what we do. And during COVID, we couldn't do readings, especially cramming that many people into such a small space. So we launched a virtual reading series in December of 2020 and began hosting things, and people would, donate and sign up for them. And then James has really expanded that. And when we were able to reopen, we purchased a screen and a microphone, and he's really expanded this hybrid series where in the last few months he's hosted a ton of poets that he'll tell you more about. But James has been a great addition. He's kind of revamped our website, our social media presence. We've gotten new t-shirts, some new ancillary merchandise. And so I will kick it over to James to talk to you more about just the day-to-day experience of being in the store and some of his encounters and some of his archiving initiatives.
Well, thank you, Dee Dee. And thank you so much for having us, Cambridge Club. I feel a little out of my depth being here, but I'm grateful. I began working as a part-time bookseller in 2018 after I served as stage manager for Grolier's 90th anniversary street festival. And I worked part-time capacity until 2020 when I was invited to work in a managerial role. And I oversee the day-to-day operations at the shop, such as interacting with customers, organizing the programming, updating our website and social media accounts, just to name a few things. And I also do a lot of archiving. I just got my master's in archiving over at Simmons in Boston. And while my relationship at Grolier is fairly new, I already have a lot of great professional and personal experiences that I have to thank the bookshop for. I've gotten the chance to hear some of the best contemporary poets writing today and hear them read their work and discuss the process of their writing. Last year, we had some writers like Tracy K. Smith, Forrest Gander, Rita Dove, Robert Pinsky, to name a few. And in addition to the poets, I also interact with publishers and their representatives. While working the day-to-day shifts at Grolier, I've noticed we attract a pretty wide audience of various people. I would say our three largest supporters are local poets, local students, and tourists. And I see that my time is running out, but I also have been involved in a lot of different archiving projects, which I'm excited to talk about at a later time. I think that's 10.
James, we'll give you a few more minutes. Keep going.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess back in the day, poets such as John Ashbery, Robert Bly, Robert Creeley, Donald Hall, Frank O'Hara, they were all regulars at the store during their time as undergraduates at Harvard. And numerous other poets and writers, including Frank Bedard, William Corbett, E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, David Ferry, Allen Ginsberg, Denise Levertov, Marion Moore, Charles Olson, the list goes on, have frequented the Grolier over the years. And since COVID, Dee Dee talked about this a little bit, we've moved towards hosting most of our events in a hybrid fashion, meaning that poets read in the store to a small audience while we simultaneously Zoom the event out to the world. And so for people in store, we check vaccine cards and we require masks for the duration of the event. So we haven't had any super spreaders to my knowledge, and thank God for that. For example, last year we were able to host an event with 6 contemporary Nigerian poets. This was before we did the hybrid events, 5 of whom were located in Nigeria. And we wouldn't have thought this to be possible pre-pandemic. So despite all the terrible things as a result of the pandemic, we consider the hybrid reading model the silver lining. And I guess I'll close on an archiving note, and that is a task that I'm really happy to be involved in with Grolier. I'll say first that the papers of Gordon Kearney and Louisa Solano, the first 2 owners of Grolier, are collected at Harvard. And I'm in talks with Woodbury Poetry Room at Harvard about moving all of our recordings of our readings to their archives. And in the meantime, I've worked on archiving many interesting pieces of history I found around the store, such as old correspondence and posters from previous readings. You'll be surprised to find various things that have ended up in various nooks and crannies in this very small room. And Louisa Solano also gifted us a number of VHS tapes, some converted to digital formats, others not. And we're housing those in the shop until we can find a better home for them. The VHS tapes have poetry readings from the 1980s and 90s. And one of the recordings was digitized. And it's an interview that Louisa did with Charles Perrault in 1984. And you can view it on our YouTube channel, which you can access through our website. On our YouTube, we upload all of our prior readings, which you can watch for free at your leisure. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the Grolier Club. Thank you. And the Cambridge Club, excuse me. Thank you so much for having us. It's been an honor.
Yeah, James, thanks so much for presenting to us, and Dee Dee, that was fabulous. I know I have a lot of questions, but the favorite part of every program is Cambridge Club members asking questions. So Cambridge Club members, please raise your hand and let me know that you have a question. Okay, well, this isn't a shy group, but people must be feeling a little bit shy.
There was a question there, Kathy, there was a question in the chat about how people's buying habits changed during the pandemic. Did they buy more or less books?
Thank you. Any speaker, could you respond to that?
I could say what we saw. I don't think overall they bought more books. I think, and again, I don't know what, Jeff, what you saw at Harvard, but 2021 sales for us were very, very similar, almost exactly to 2019. What we did see, obviously, the shift to much more buying online. I think that people also bought more books at a time. When we look at our figures of how many customers were in the store in a day and what sales were, the average sale is definitely noticeably higher since the pandemic. I know that there were all sorts of reports of overall more books being sold. I know that's what the publishers said. I wouldn't say, though, that we saw a huge increase in overall sales, except during certain periods, like immediately after the George Floyd murder and the books on anti-racism and white privilege at the very beginning of the pandemic, when everyone decided that this was finally the time that they should read Anna Karenina or some other 900-page book that they had never had a chance to read before. It is amazing how many copies of more than 800-page 19th century novels. I don't know if you saw the same thing, Jeff, but it was absolutely, and people said, oh, I've always wanted to read this, and now I'm going to be stuck in my house forever, so I'm buying all these tomes. Anyway, that's what we saw.
Yeah.
Jeff or James or Ndidi, do you want to respond to that question as well?
Yeah, I'll add something. I mean, mostly I agree with what David said. And in fact, holiday sales in 2021 were basically the same as they were in 2019, which was our best year ever. The one place where sales were disappointing is the loss of the physical events where people came to buy books to get signed by the author. Sales for Zoom events don't come near to sales for the physical events. There are a few exceptions of that. In some cases, we're a very prominent author. We could require a book purchase as part of attending the event, but the majority of events are not like that. They're free to the public. And so book sales at events are lower than they were prior to the pandemic, which makes sense. In a physical event, you can meet the author, you can talk to the author, and so you're encouraged to buy the book. It's different in a virtual event.
James, and Ndidi, were people buying a lot of poetry to help them through the pandemic?
I'll say poetry is a very niche market. That's what I'll say. But the holiday sales this year were probably the best that they've ever been. I don't know if that has to do with COVID or not.
Yeah, I think dovetailing on what David spoke about with people's localism, I think during the pandemic, people became much more aware of needing to support local businesses. And for us, we were blessed that we were able to take advantage of bookshop.org. And I think there's kind of been a push, especially among students and professors and stuff, to purchase, from either directly from independent bookstores or from bookshop.org. And so we were able to shift some of our business to that, which was very helpful. But I can't really speak to overall sales. We are a very niche market.
Yeah, thank you. Jim Roosevelt.
I have a question for any of the bookshop folks. Has the retreat of books to the upper floors of the coop affected your sales?
It's a great question. It's hard to tell. I think I did notice an increase in sales, not when that happened, but when Joan Wickersham's piece appeared in the Boston Globe. But it's really hard to tell because as everybody's been talking about, book sales during the pandemic have been surprisingly good, and it's really hard to tell whether there's any sort of correlation between the two.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. More? Okay, Mary Catherine Diebel.
Sorry, unmuting there. I was so interested to hear from the Grolier folks, and it's because I've been very interested since I've been working at Cambridge Center for Adult Education, and been very involved as an old-time English major in kind of trying to help revive or be interested in Blacksmith House poetry series. And many of the same poets who read, at this Monday night series that's been around for 50 years are also reading at Grolier bookstore. The question is, have you seen an increase in, and I think you've dealt with this a little bit in two speakers ago. I feel like poetry is kind of getting a bit of a resurgence. And I'm wondering how Jeff thinks about that in Porter Square bookstore, thinks about the fact that are people reading more poetry? I certainly know, just from the time of, when I came on in 2017 compared to 2022, there are more people coming to poetry readings, that's for sure. And of course, we had 2 years where they were on Zoom, and that actually meant even more people were, and a lot of famous, great, interesting poets were tuning in from all over the country. So the question is our poetry sales really up? Is that just my imagination? Or, are we facing a resurgence of poetry, which I'm hoping is true?
I can't really speak to statistics. We're such a tiny operation that we don't really have data on, poetry sales in general. But I will say that, the last couple of years with the sort of the poetry is an art, and it kind of speaks to the universal human condition. And with the pandemic and all the suffering and kind of trauma around that, as well as the racial reckoning after George Floyd, I feel like a lot of people who were poets turned to poetry as sort of a coping mechanism or an outlet for expression. And at a couple of our readings, people have spoken about that, or their poems have touched on that, and that has been really powerful and moving. So I don't know about sales, but I do think that as an art form, perhaps more people have turned to it during these last few years that have been difficult.
Something, and Dee Dee and James, that I found interesting about the Grolier is some of your poets are from other countries. I mean, you talked about Nigerian poets presenting virtually, but as I understand it, you have people from Japan sending you poetry for sale as well, right? It's not just American poetry, it's stuff, English poetry from all over the world, and maybe in other languages too.
Hey, honey, look at this.
Oh, absolutely. We have a lot of, James can probably speak to more of the different sections, but there's a Japanese poet that has us sell her book on consignment, and she'll send us new copies from Japan. We have a lot of translations. One of the books that my dad published with the Gorilla imprint by Tino Villanueva was published in English, but it's now been translated into Russian, Spanish, French, Italian. It was made into a dramatic production in France last summer. So that was definitely high priority for both Louisa and my father. My father's from Nigeria, and he wrote his undergraduate thesis on Ezra Pound at Pomona and won an award for it. And that was kind of what turned him on to poetry. So he was very intrigued and grateful for the fact that, this boy from Nigeria had fallen in love with this poetry bookstore that was, very, had been frequented by some of the biggest names in Western in literature. So that's an important part of our business and of our institution, is to continue to invite and to promote international poets.
Thank you. David, Jeff, did you want to respond to that question about, are you selling more poetry, or do you know if you're selling more poetry?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is there really has been a growth in the poetry community, particularly among young people, which I think is an interesting phenomenon. We see a proliferation of chapbooks and homemade poetry journals, and also the tremendous interest through competitions and others in spoken word poetry. And so that represents a really significant movement in this space. And it's grown significantly recently.
Yeah, I completely agree. The only thing I would add to that is I think that the demographic, people that are older, like what I would call more traditional poetry, but among people who are younger, I think there's a lot, and a lot of that stuff doesn't find its way into bookstores for the reasons that Jeff's talking about. But for example, we did, before the pandemic, when one could still do such things, we used to do a once-a-month poetry series for local poets at the Aeronaut Brewery, because that's where you're going to find nowadays the people who are many of the biggest fans of poets. They're our kids' demographic, and they're not necessarily looking to go into a bookstore for a poetry reading, but would love to go to one in a brewery.
Kathy, this is Nancy Woods. The Cambridge Arts Council has a sidewalk poetry contest every year where I think you're limited to 10 lines, can have your poem emblazoned in a sidewalk. There's one on Prospect Street. There's one on Granite Street. They're actually all over, and you'll see them. And my husband actually has one on the sidewalk. And then the library steps has his poem and others on the stairs, on the stair risers. So I think for the city to have a poetry contest for sidewalks, it's pretty crazy for poems.
It's wonderful. Keija, you have a question?
Yes. So my question was for David specifically. That's fascinating. I had no idea that the Porter Square Bookstore had sort of co-ownership in terms of 10 members of the staff were also owners of the bookstore. I know recently that you branched out to Boston and the new Grub Street headquarters location in the Seaport. Curious how you see having this sort of second location in Boston, either helping to promote more books or this sort of collaboration with Grub Street, considering it's a sort of a literary resource for writers in the community, how that's going so far and what your sort of hopes are for it in terms of success.
Sure. Well, I'll say, first of all, we've worked with Grub Street on a lot of things before the bookstore. Cambridge, believe it or not, Cambridge has, or for a long time had, as many independent bookstores selling new books as the entire city of Boston. It was absolutely shocking that, to me at least, that for a city that considers itself as cultural and literary as Boston, for a long time, there was the Trident bookstore. There's a small bookstore in JP called Paper Cuts, and those within the city limits of Boston, those were the two bookstores for a very long time. And whether it's Charleston, the South End or the North End or Allston or all over the neighborhoods of Boston. So part of it was just, Boston is grossly underserved by bookstores. The Seaport, and this is a very long discussion, is a really challenging neighborhood because it's sort of just come to exist in the last 15 years, where before we all remember parking lots and warehouses, and so it's not really clear what kind of, it's still in the process of becoming the neighborhood that it's going to become. We're very much a neighborhood bookstore in North Cambridge, and our goal was to be a neighborhood bookstore down in Boston, but we don't yet know what that neighborhood is, and we're still learning. Everyone's very excited about it. It's another thing that we felt more comfortable doing because of our ownership structure, where we had a lot more hands to row the oars. But it's still it's been 3 months. It's still way too early to tell.
Well, congrats on it. I look forward to visiting it.
Eric Grunbaum, you had a question.
Well, thank you for the really great presentations and for running bookstores in Cambridge, which having grown up here, I truly appreciate, and having seen the decline of other bookstores. One question, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but I wonder if there are ways to collaborate between bookstores, maybe an annual event of some kind, or maybe there already is such a thing. But it seems like, perhaps there's some competition, but there's also some collaboration might be possible. So I guess anybody could riff on that if you feel like it.
Well, I'll jump in and I'll say two things. Number one is, I think it's easy to view, for example, the Harvard Bookstore and the Porter Square Bookstore as competitors because we're a mile apart up the same street. But in the grand scheme of things, the competitor is not Jeff and me, it's that company with an A. There's plenty of space in, Harvard Square used to have 25 bookstores. It can certainly support, 3 or 4. So, and there are a lot of areas in which bookstores work together. from the Boston Book Festival, which unfortunately hasn't happened in the last 2 years, but all the major bookstores in Boston participate in the Boston Book Festival. There's Independent Bookstore Day, which happens every year at the end of April or beginning of May, where there are always activities being planned between bookstores. A couple of years ago, someone did almost like a trolley ride that went to 5 or 6 bookstores in Boston, Cambridge, Brookline. So there's a lot of ways in which we can work together. Our people know each other. I have people who used to work for Jeff. Jeff has people who used to work for me. There's a lot of, it's a very insular community. Coming from technology, as both Jeff and I did, it was shocking to me the first time I went to a bookstore conference, because you could just imagine in the software, any technology industry, where you go to a conference and speaker after speaker gets up and says, "We had the greatest idea of what to do with our business. Let me tell you about it so you could do it in yours also." And this is what the bookstore industry is like. Like, everyone is sharing ideas, the kind of thing that in other types of industry would never happen. So it's a very, very collegial business. And for me, that was, coming from outside the business, that was the single most unexpected thing about coming into it. I thought it would be competitive, and among bookstores, it really doesn't feel that way at all.
Yeah, I agree completely with David on that. And one thing I wanted to add is that there's a lot of collaboration which takes place behind the scenes that is invisible to the public. Any given occasion, well, if we do an event and suddenly we realize we don't have enough books,
right,
we have no problem
calling down the street.
We call each other, and our fellow booksellers are happy to provide books to deal with that crisis. That's a simple example, but it shows the really collegial relationship. We're a small community. We all know each other. We're all doing the same stuff. And so there's a lot of opportunities to share.
And I felt very lucky having the opportunity to talk with each of you before the program, and to really feel your passion, each of your passion for the work that you're doing. I've been so impressed with how creative each of you have been and resourceful, and how you've developed so many different partnerships. You've reached out to the schools, you've reached out to the library, you've reached out to the science department at Harvard and done collaborations. You've reached out to the business community doing programs in the streets. Anyway, I'm so incredibly impressed with your work and grateful. We have 2 more questions. I'm hoping we can finish up by 7:15.
There's also a couple of questions in the chat, Kathy.
Okay. Dan, you've had your hand up for a while, and then Ann Cushman, why don't you go first, Dan? Oh, Dan, you're muted. Dan, we can't hear you.
Okay, you should be able to hear me now. Building on this notion of collaboration, it seems like each of the bookstore owners are interested in, well, I wonder to what extent you can have collaboration between self-publishing of books and working with bookstores around that. Because Jeff has got, a press that he's able to, create books, and I'm wondering whether or not he's helping in the terms of selling and marketing of them, and whether, and Dee Dee's doing, with Grolier seems to be doing something, and then in terms of, in terms of Porter Square, you've got the relationship with Grub Street. So I'm just curious about authors self-publishing and working with independent bookstores.
The way the world works right now, it really, a lot of it depends on, and this doesn't only apply to self-published authors, it applies to mid-list authors. They're responsible basically for their own publicity. And so they spend a lot of their time, visiting independent bookstores, trying to get the bookstores to take their books on consignment and all of that. So many books that we publish, for example, that are printed on our machine, the authors take those books and they go to the various independent bookstores and ask them to carry it, to carry them. So that's a type that, that's a type of situation which responds to the question you're asking, Dan. And in some cases, we've actually been able to print books, which publishers often run out of books. Some of those books we're able to print. And so we've done things like print books to help replenish both our stock and the stock of other stores in the city.
Would you do any mailing to them? Mailing to for them if somebody wants to, have it printed by you and then mailed by you?
Oh yeah, we do that. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, all the books that are self-published are on our website, and so people order them from all over the world. There's a fellow who sits on the corner of, some of you may know him, Alistair. He's a homeless fellow.
Oh, yeah.
But Alistair just wrote a book, and we printed it on the machine. And of course, and we've been shipping them out to all of his relatives in Scotland and France and various places in Europe.
Ann Cushman, you had a question. You must unmute yourself. Just click on in the lower left.
Yeah. Now am I unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Yeah, so I didn't have a question, but I will say thank you to all the 4 speakers. It's been illuminating and really inspiring to hear people talk about resilience in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Anne. Bob Simha had a question. What proportion of your costs are rent? How would ownership of your site help with the economics of operating a bookstore?
I would consider selling my firstborn child if I could own the space in which I operated my bookstore. Everyone I know who is in a place that is not like Cambridge in terms of what rents are, says that if you can own your space, you control your destiny. We're in a spot where not only is space expensive, there's very, very, very few, if any, locations that would fit our requirements. And like I say, our landlord has been very generous to us, and we've run. But if I could own my own space, I would. I don't think it's practical for us, and I dare say, for Jeff in Harvard Square would probably say the same thing. But every bookstore owner wants to own their physical space, and relatively few get to.
And I understand Harvard owns both the Harvard Bookstore and the Grolier, right? Your spaces, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
they're a landlord.
Sorry. There's a saying in the book industry that if you want to get rich in bookselling, buy the building.
That's not that different than restaurants, by the way, either.
But it helps if you can't buy the building, it helps to have an enlightened landlord. And I think David does, and certainly Grolier and we have an enlightened landlord, very committed to the survival of our stores. The alternative, if you're in a commercial building, then you're in trouble, as I found out in my warehouse. Once again, they decided just come along and triple the rent.
Why don't we do one more?
Please don't repeat to my daughter what I said about my firstborn child.
Tell her. Renata von Scharner, do you want to, have some very interesting comments. Do you want to speak them, or should I read them?
Well, my parents met in a bookstore. My mother was a seller in a bookstore, and she was a big lover of books. And I think in the age when it's hard for people to meet, I think bookstores are the best place to meet. And I hope that bookstores can make use of that in their reading, in their programs, because people also need places to meet people. So I'm very grateful for what you do. Thank you.
My wife and I met at a book fair, not in a bookstore, but at a book fair.
And my wife and I had our first date at Wordsworth.
There you go.
Wow. Okay, and Dee Dee,
the proof is in the pudding. Here we go.
what can you tell us?
Sorry, what was the question?
I was just gonna say, did you meet your husband at a bookstore?
I did not, unfortunately, but I've heard of not romantic meetings, but many friendship meetings, and maybe James knows of some romantic ones.
I met my girlfriend in a poetry class, so sort of similar, I guess. Bookstores are very romantic. They totally are.
I think that might be where we should close this program. I mean, on that high note, I encourage you all to go to bookstores and to patronize these wonderful independent bookstores that are clearly labors of love that provide so much richness for our community. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to hear from our speakers, unless you want to hang on for another few minutes, just a few minutes, about their partnerships, because I am incredibly impressed with their partnerships within the community. Do you want to stay on for just like 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes? Why don't we hear about partnerships and then we'll close shop. David, I know you're partnering with young teen authors, or authors of sort of teen literature, right? Authors, and you have programs at the high school where you're giving away books, and you have programs at the library, and you're on the board there. Can you
Sure.
talk?
I'll just say I mean, like Jeff was saying about Harvard, we do a lot of events for local authors, especially for, YA authors tend to often come to Porter Square. And I don't think in that regard that we're doing anything different than a lot of other stores. What we are doing that you alluded to, that's one of the things I didn't get to mention, but I'm proudest of, is we did start a not-for-profit foundation about 5 years ago that brings authors into schools in Cambridge and Somerville and Boston, and then and buys books for all the kids so that everyone can meet a real author and leave with their own signed copy of a book. And it's been a really eye-opening experience, because all these communities are places where you have a lot of students who come from different book cultures than what my children grew up with, where they might, either because of economic or cultural reasons, they don't grow up with tons of books at home, and owning their own book is actually a huge deal, and meeting a real author it's a tremendous experience for them. And so that we've been doing that for several years, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of.
Jeff, I loved hearing about your partnership with the physics department at Harvard. Can you speak of that a little bit?
One of the, Melissa Franklin, who is a professor of physics, in fact, she's the first woman to receive tenure in the Harvard physics department, came up to me one day and said, let's do a book talk series. And so I said, sure, why not? And so we started that, and we sent out invitations to scientists who had written books all over the world. And it's gotten to the point where nobody says no. We do these often several times a week. The scientists by Zoom come in from all over the planet. Attendance is much better than they are at a typical Zoom talk. And it's, we've had Nobel Prize winners and people doing cutting edge research in all kinds of scientific fields. And so it's been, successful beyond our wildest dreams. So it's been quite the thing.
Thank you. And Dee Dee and James, one of the things that I loved hearing you talk about was how there are only 3 poetry bookstores in the United States. We are so lucky to have the Grolier, which is the oldest poetry bookstore in the nation, right?
Yes. We are very proud of that we've been able to hang on.
Yeah. So you had mentioned, I think there's one in Brooklyn, and there's one is it in Portland? Where's the other one?
It's in Seattle. Open Books is in Seattle, and then Burroughs is in Brooklyn. But we are 95 years young as of this year. So certainly the oldest.
And you're organizing some sort of event to celebrate that 95th anniversary, right? Or
yeah,
we hope you will.
Not clear what we'll be doing, but we are in initial talks to do some celebratory events.
Yeah. Well, again, I thank all of you for keeping these stores vibrant and they are a gift to the city. And I thank you for presenting to us tonight. And I am sure all of our members will be patronizing your stores and attending your programs. With that, I thank you so much. Good evening. And I hope you'll be enjoying a good book tonight.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.